Welcome one and all to another episode of the Coaster101 podcast. I'm Andrew Sowell, North Carolina, and joining me on the podcast this week after what feels like a months-long hiatus, probably because it was, is our California correspondent, Eric Woolley. Eric, how are you?
Good. How are you, Andrew?
It's a beautiful day. I love it.
Glad to hear it.
So, Eric, you've decided to grace us with your presence on the show again this week. You had the opportunity to visit Knott's Bearry Farm for a preview of their 100th anniversary celebration. For those paying it, who haven't been paying attention, Knott's, like anybody else that had a big milestone anniversary in 2020, unfortunately had to postpone that. So it is the 100th anniversary celebration in the 101st year of operation for Knott's. Eric, my first question for you, what was it like being back at Knott's Bearry Farm?
It was great. So the park, for people who didn't know, during the pandemic, the park was, when they couldn't open as a theme park, they were doing food festivals almost constantly throughout the year. And then when the Taste of Boysenberry Festival ended at the beginning of May, they were doing season pass holder previews basically up until May 21st. And then so May 21st was their official grand reopening to the public where anyone could go. And so the Thursday night before, they did sort of a kickoff ceremony that I got to go to. And then I also went to the park on the first Friday that they were open. But yeah, it felt great to be back in the park. It looked great. You could tell that they were excited to be reopening. I was talking to one ride operator on Friday when I was waiting in line, and he'd mentioned, he'd sort of been working there through all the food festivals. So they sort of, from their side, they kind of felt like they had been, I think, more open than a lot of California parks. But you could tell from people visiting that they were excited to be there. Yeah, and excited to have them sort of be able to start all of this kind of special event that they had been planning to do last year, which was basically it's actually unclear to me if it's what the 100th anniversary, if they have the exact date. It is my understanding the 100th anniversary of when Walter Knott opened a Bearry stand in Buena Park, California in the 1920s, but it's not totally clear to me which year he opened that. So maybe this is actually the 100th anniversary of Walter Knott starting his Bearry stand. So who knows?
It's all marketing at this point. It could be like the 98th,
yes.
And we're just going to round up to the 100th.
And they are not changed. They are calling it the 100th anniversary Knott's Family Reunion. I mean, they were always calling the festival, kind of this months-long festival, the Knott's Family Reunion. They're still calling it that. So I think whether it's the 100th or 101st or 99th or whatever, it sort of doesn't really matter.
Got it. And you went to this event, this kickoff event, kind of preview event. And I know with it being Knott's and Knott's coming off of their run of successful food festivals, I'm imagining the food at this event had to be pretty top notch.
Yeah, so it was one of the things that they were sort of showing off is that I guess technically so it's the Knott's Family Reunion, and they're also now they started their Knott's Summer Nights kind of festival, which includes music and stuff like that. And I think that's what all the food items, and that at some point there will be tasting cards for a bunch of these, and they've got sort of temporary booths set up in places. As is often the case with Knott's food events, they sort of give you too much food with each taste. So the friends
Darn,
that I went with, I know. Well, it's we were given tasting cards that had 6 tickets on them. But I do not know how one person could possibly go through all 6 tasting cards, and certainly not in a 3-hour evening event. Try even with the tickets also being good for beverages, both alcoholic and non-alcoholic Knott's beverages. I only got through 5 tickets. It was sort of, but yeah, it's as always with Knott's, there's some interesting stuff and some that misses the mark, but a lot of it that hits the mark, and then sort of they're good at reusing old favorites and having at least a few items that have a little bit of a boysenberry touch to them, although not as much as during the Boysenberry Festival. But yeah, we got a fun bun. I was there with 2 other people, so That's, I think, the right number of people to split a fun bun with. uh, yeah, first fun bun that I've had in maybe 2 years, something like that.
Oh gosh. And you had you had the boysenberry beer too, right? I know you're a little bit of a craft beer drinker.
I did had boysenberry beer and boysenberry cider. They had one of my friends also. They had a boysenberry sangria that I think they'd also had during the boysenberry festival. All very delicious. I don't know. I feel like back in past boysenberry festivals, they always sort of had different breweries do the beer. But this one tastes like the same as it's been at the last couple boysenberry festivals, so I feel like they've locked in on that. The boysenberry sangria was pretty tasty as well. I was impressed by it. Actually had it was I was sort of expecting it to be sweet just because like it's theme park sangria, but it was actually had a nice balance to it. Good wine flavor in it.
Nice.
Yeah, so good food, good drinks. I think those will be available. I'm not sure if I think they'll be available soon, although I'm not sure if they've started the full summer nights and tasting cards for that yet. But always good.
Walking around the park, I mean, how is it? How's the decoration for the family reunion 100th, 101st, 102nd, whatever year it is anniversary?
Yeah, so that's the I know, so the friends that I went with they lived down in Orange County, so they'd been to all the food festivals, had been to Taste of Boysenberry, and so when we first got in, there was sort of lots of sort of like bunting hanging from like all of the buildings in Ghost Town, and like lots of sparkly Knott's 100th signage kind of all over the place, and like a lot of it was, I was wondering like, oh, has this been there all year since they've been planning to do this last year? And my friends were like, no, this was all new. Like that decoration wasn't there. So clearly in the like, I don't know if it was during pass holder previews or stuff, they've been setting up things for the 100th anniversary. Around all of the stages, they had signage and decoration set up for all of that. I know that during the Thursday night event, they had sort of a small like video that they showed, and the VP and GM of the park gave a brief talk. They had like clips of celebrities who were like, oh, I like went to Knott's as a kid and I'm so excited to bring my family back and that kind of thing. Terry Crews is apparently a big Knott's Berry Farm fan, so I'll try and get him on the podcast at some point. And so they had like stages for that all set up, and that's all part of the Knott's Summer Nights event. And then I think the other thing that like stood out is sort of a decoration is there are the first one we passed, it didn't like register in my mind what it was, but then as we saw more of them, it was clear that there were they have now set up kind of photo op booths that are all related, like small models, prop mock-ups of past Knott's Berry Farm rides. So there was one for the Haunted Shack and one for Kingdom of the Dinosaurs, one over like near Accelerator for Wacky Soapbox Racers. So a bunch of those set up that all had like both a spot that you could take a picture and something that looks like the ride, as well as like little plaques that explain the history of, oh, what this is, what it was when it was there, when it left, which was kind of neat. And certainly for both theme park geeks or like people who went to Knott's years ago or something, like, oh, they can go and see these little touches of and references to Knott's history, which I think is a nice way of sort of celebrating the past of the park that mostly hadn't been there before. Like I think lots of those old rides basically, like, I don't remember them being referenced in other parts of the park. And these, if listeners go onto the site and look at the write-up that I posted last week, you can see a bunch of pictures of some of these and what they look like.
Gotcha. And I have to ask, because I haven't read the article yet, is there any nod to the Windjammer surf racers?
I don't think so. The 5 that I remember were, so the Haunted Shack, Kingdom of Dinosaurs, Wacky Soapbox Racers, one for I think it's Sky Jump or Parachute Jump, the like ride that was sort of, I think, near where Hang Time is, and then the Knott's K Tower, which I guess is actually the other sort of big improvement, is that the giant, I think, observation tower at one point, like that was there, has like a big new giant K on it that is what was there back in, I think, like the 70s or 80s when it was first installed. And so there's down below that is a sign referencing nothing on Windjammer.
Okay, that's okay. It's as they say, it's gone, and I think I might be the only person who hasn't forgotten it, so it's okay.
I think that for coaster enthusiasts, there's some good wacky soapbox racers mentions. I hadn't noticed Thursday night, but when I was there Friday, there's like at the wacky soapbox racers one. And I noticed that each of the photo ops like also have speakers with soundtracks to them. And the wacky soapbox racer, I think, has like the announcement that was like the announcement on the coaster when you were like getting ready to ride and stuff about it.
Nice. And obviously, you can't have an anniversary at a park without leaning full on into the retro merch. And I know when you were at the park on Friday, you sent out these retro posters that look amazing. And if I had any wall space whatsoever, I was going to have you send me one. But what were some of the other retro merch options that you saw for the 100th anniversary?
Yeah, so there were a ton on the same old rides that like they were acknowledging places like stuff for wacky soapbox racers, a bunch of like t-shirts and magnets and stuff like that, and for rides like Kingdom of the Dinosaurs and stuff. And I think I saw them in sort of the shops right next to the new Knott's Berry Tales Return to the Fair, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But kind of they were clearly leaning into a lot of that throwback stuff. And then in I forget the name of the store, but the one that's basically across the way from where Knott's Berry Tales is, they had basically, it was like, so where that's where they had all these posters, and they had set up basically, there was like an art exhibit in there that had been, I think it was 2 or 3 local artists had like made actual like original art related to Knott's and Knott's history and stuff, and like you could both buy like an original canvas of that as well as prints, or I think the posters may have come from one of those artists that were like these were prints of their artwork. And so there's a bunch of neat stuff like that were sort of exhibits about Knott's history that also had this pretty good artwork, if anybody like really wants an original Knott's art piece.
I kind of do. Like I said, I don't have the wall space though. I'm looking around and I'm like, get ready to move, and it's just like I have.
Let's see how much space you have in your new place. Maybe you'll end up next time I'm at Knott's, I'll pick up something for you.
All right, sounds good. But on the subject of Knott's history, we got to talk about the return of Whittles, and because I am somebody, and when we talked with Patrick Wisniewski on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. We talked about Ringo Raccoon and the whole cast of Carowinds characters from 1973. Ringo Raccoon, Hercules the dog, Petunia the pig. I could go on and on for these costume characters. And it seems to be kind of a trend. I know Dorney Park has brought back Alfundo the clown, and Knott's has brought back Whittles, who is this just old prospector. You mentioned he reminds you a lot of the San Francisco 49ers mascot, and having seen a picture of him, I completely agree. Do you have any recollection of Whittles does he predate your Knott's Berry Farm fandom?
So like I know that I went to Knott's once as a kid when Whittles maybe was still around, but like I have very vague memories of it. So yes, he's like an old-timey prospector character, but like looks like a sports mascot, like big foam head kind of thing. And I think he was introduced in like the 70s, probably as a like I don't know if Knott's had like Peanut stuff back then, like if they had any kind of like kid friendly character, but they definitely had Ghost Town. And so I think he was introduced probably then as like here's a character that kids can take pictures with, that fits in with Ghost Town, which I think is very interesting because I feel like, for the last 5 to 10 years, Ghost Town's been sort of, I mean, even longer than that, Ghost Town has always been realistic is maybe not exactly the right word, but sort of certainly when Ghost Town Alive started a few years ago, but even before that, like there were, there's an actual blacksmith in Ghost Town that like, it's a guy they're blacksmithing, and you could do the thing where you go and you talk to the guy in the jail, and there's a guy hiding with like a microphone and can talk back to you. And so like, it's like Ghost Town is populated by humans. If you ride the train, like the train gets robbed, and it's by like actual people, not a cartoon character. So I think I don't know, like, was there overlap where there were these actual people in Ghost Town and it was supposed to be a real setting? and also this cartoon walk around character. But I do think it was sort of fun to like see, oh, okay, they've got this throwback character that, yeah, I assume people who were kids in the 70s or 80s like would remember, might have fond memories for, and I think it was, I mean, even during the like opening ceremony event, it's sort of like they had at the end, they had like people and costume characters like run out and like sing and dance for like a final song at the end of this sort of kickoff talk by the GM. And it was like funny that there's like, okay, there's like a couple people dressed in like, you know, semi-authentic Old West garb, and then also like a Peanuts character and Whittles, and now like new characters from Knott's Berry Tales. They're all sort of here interacting together with each other, and hey, like any like this has no pretense of immersion for Ghost Town right now. And so I don't know, when I was there on Friday, Whittles he's not like the meet and greet spot for him was not like in the middle of Ghost Town. It was sort of a little on the edge of Ghost Town. So it's like, okay, maybe they'll like try and still have some like Ghost Town realism, but still let kids hang out with Whittles. But I did appreciate that both him and that there are like now walk around characters from Knott's Berry Tales. They're like, okay, there are now multiple characters at Knott's that are original IP that, I mean, Whittles existed before, but not recently. And so like these sort of a bunch of characters that are now around that are original IP for the park, which is, I know that some parts of like Disney fandom complain about like, oh, everything is, you know, movie IP and there's no more original IP in Disney parks. And it's like, oh, well, now Knott's is sort of leaning more into their original IP while still having the Snoopy stuff as like a very separate part of the park.
Nice. And I mean, we're 16, 17 minutes into this podcast right now, and we are a roller coaster podcast, so I'd probably be strung up by my fingernails if I didn't ask you how the coasters are running after a year's hiatus of sorts.
Yes. So the park is open, requiring reservations. They're still capacity limited, and at least as of now, I think this is supposed to. The rules are changing, I believe, on June 15th, and we'll see how quickly the park changes. They're still doing like alternate row boarding on the roller coasters, so lines are kind of long, even with the limited capacity. If you can get in early, because the way the reservations work, I think it's the same as most parks. It's like there's reservation slots and you can show up anytime after your time slot. And so I got there, mine was at like 11:30. So I got there about then, and like lines were getting long, but definitely not as bad as they were later. I imagine if you had the 10 a.m. reservation, like you could get in, you would have very short lines for the first hour. So operationally, that's like, okay, there's like, expect some long waits on the coasters. But in terms of how they were running, I mean, we rode, so Thursday night at the event, rode hang time at night. It was still lots of fun. It is still, you saw the pictures probably on Instagram or something, like still looks great with that KCL lighting at night. The lighting is still up and running. The next day I was like sort of Accelerator, always fun. I had heard that briefly during pass holder previews, they were doing 2-train operation, which is a rarity on Accelerator. When I was there, they were only doing 1-train operation. That may be like, it could be staffing or just like, depending on how busy they're expecting it to be, whether they put the second train on. Ghost Rider was running great. As always, it has the longest line, although the Knott app wait times, which is maybe a problem with all Cedar Fair apps, their wait times are not very accurate. So like sometimes it was like, oh, it says 15 minutes, actually half an hour. Luckily, Ghost Rider, it said like 90 minutes or 75 minutes, and I think it was a little under an hour. So got to do it a little old school with your park planning in terms of, okay, let's look at the length of the line and try and guess. And the lines are like, people were pretty good about social distancing still in line, so they always look a little bit longer than they are. But yeah, they were all running great. Ghost Rider was like, that's when I got off of it, sort of like, man, it's hard for me to remember now that it was rough and bad a few years ago before GCI came and did some work on it, because it feels so good now. Like it's not rough at all, and like it's the moments on it and the length are very impressive. It's one of those things that if I ever have to rank like California wooden coasters, I will have a very hard time, because I sort of each time I like, that's one that like, oh, every time I ride on it, I'm like, oh, this is really good. I don't know. How does this compare to things like the Giant Dipper and Gold Striker? It's like, top of that list is tough. But yeah, everything was open. They were all running well. Only downside is that waits are kind of long. And I think part of that was also operation staffing, as I think most theme park fans have now read about. Parks are having trouble staffing. Shout out to the operators of Montezuma's Revenge, who were both like, there was one guy who was both like assigning people to rows and then doing all the safety checks, and like having to handle like, okay, socially just like alternate rows, and like so that groups aren't next to each other, while also then going through and checking things. And he was working very hard. It seemed like a high stress situation to be the only guy on the platform when having to deal with that. So, but hopefully in a few weeks, the like social distancing on rides requirements will be lifted, and it can sort of smooth out some of that operational stuff.
Got it. Well, let's transition here a little bit into Knott's Berry Farm's new for 2021 attraction, which is actually kind of a remix of an old favorite at Knott's Berry Farm, and it's Knott's Berry Tales Return to the Fair. And for those who are unfamiliar, there was a dark ride at Knott's Berry Farm in the 70s. It was called Knott's Berry Tales. It was actually designed by former Disney Imagineer Raleigh Crump. And it lasted at the park for, a decade or so, and then became this thing called Kingdom of the Dinosaurs, which closed in 2004. The building sat empty for a while, according to the internet, and then became Voyage to the Iron Reef, which was a interactive dark ride shooter from Triotech. That opened in 2015, I believe, operated for a couple years. And Knott's closed it early in 2020 to come up with this new attraction, also designed by Triotech, Knott's Berry Tales Return to the Fair. So, Eric, you are somebody who has ridden both Voyage to the Iron Reef and Knott's Berry Tales now. The new one, not the old one.
Yeah. I'm old, but I'm not quite that old.
That's all good. How does it compare? I mean, how does Knott's Berry Tales Return to the Fair compare to its predecessor, Voyage to the Iron Reef?
Yeah, so I think, when Voyage to the Iron Reef opened, like, I was pretty excited about it because I like dark rides, and Triotech, I think, has made some good ones in the past, and it was nice to see that Knott's was doing, an original IP and putting a dark ride back in to add to, because they've got a few dark ride-esque things, the Calico Mine Ride and Timber Mountain Log Ride, Log Flume, but well themed inside. And I think it was like, you could see what they were going for, and I think it was like a valiant attempt, but it like didn't really hit the mark. I think there were a couple things about it that, one, it was like the theme didn't really make sense or fit with any of the rest of the park. Like, it was sort of this steampunky theme where like a metal sea monstery thing like is attacking Knott's Berry Farm, as if Knott's Berry Farm, which I guess the like theme of the Roaring Twains and Boardwalk area, that part of the park where it's kind of in between them, is that it's on the coast, even though it's not actually. And so like you have to go like save the park and destroy this sea monster. But it was like, there wasn't like, there weren't any characters, and like it wasn't something that was like made sense necessarily to be at Knott's. Like, it could have been at any park. You would be like, oh yeah, okay, steampunk shooty ride. And then I think it was also sort of, I don't know how much of this is like just the technology wasn't, I think I'm always surprised by how much animation technology improves over like 5 years, but I felt like lots of the graphics on kind of, so it's a mix of screen with some props and practical things. And the screens, like, the animation quality on them just like wasn't great. Like, it sort of felt like in my mind, it always felt like a video game that was maybe 5 years older than it actually was. And then like, as each year, it was sort of like, oh, this looks and feels more and more dated as time goes. So I think it was like, it was fine, but it was not something that was special. And I feel like Knott's Berry Tales has done a much better job of like both making sense with the park and also like the theme is sort of, it's obviously like lean into something that park's history, and like there's not any other bear boysenberry pie factory. Like, I don't know how much we want to get into the plot of the ride. Is that there is the bear family boysenberry pie factory, and Crafty Coyote is stealing pies, and you're trying to recover the pies for the bears. And that's like, it doesn't make sense with like the rest of the park, but it sort of at least leans into some of like the boysenberry part of Knott's Berry Farm. And then I think that it is sort of like these cartoon animal characters, is that it sort of makes it, I think the animation quality has improved, but it also like doesn't, like, it's not trying to look realistic. So which I think is a common situation in all animation, right? It's why like Pixar doesn't make photorealistic people in its movies. And so I think by having like, okay, these are cartoon animal characters, so they don't like, they look good because they're kind of cute animated characters, which I think helps a lot compared to one of the things that was sort of an issue with Voyage to the Iron Reef.
Yeah, I'm looking back at our 2019 interview with Noel Van Gnuchen. I'm sorry, Noel, if you're listening. I'm not going to be able to pronounce your last name, but we talked with Triotech at IAPA, and they were talking about how Knott's Berry Tales was such just this iconic IP when it came to Knott's, and they were so, I don't want to say concerned. Concerned is not the right word, but they were so kind of focused. They called it their North Star, to kind of reinvent Berry Tales for a current audience, work better or work as well for the targeted audience in 2021, just as well as it did 40 years ago. Yeah. And so they had access to all the original concepts from Raleigh Crump, and Crump was he was a
consultant, I think.
He was a consultant on the project. Yeah. And it's just, based on the pictures, and I'm trying to stay as spoiler free, based on the pictures I've seen, it looks really, really fun. And I need to get back out to the West Coast to experience it. But what was the gameplay like? Obviously, you're in a dark ride vehicle. You've got your gun, which is a highly themed blaster, right?
Yeah. So the original one had like a gun with a trigger that you pull, like lots of dark ride shooters. Now it's more like, as you're familiar with Midway Mania, with the like thing that you pull back on to shoot, and you're launching little blasts of, I think the idea is that somehow is a jelly blaster, you're shooting boysenberry jelly that somehow makes the pies come back to you. The great thing about being a cartoon is it doesn't matter that it doesn't make any sense. And it feels like they were maybe like a little less responsive than like Midway Mania, but I think, but they actually felt pretty good. I think they're like, the design of the gun itself is very silly, which I thought was like fun. Like, it's dumb. It like looks like a jar of jelly with like a little string that's shaped like a boysenberry on the back, and it's like, this is silly. Like, that is what this is clearly themed to be kind of a silly family ride. I do think that one of the issues with Voyage to the Iron Reef, and an issue that I have on lots of dark rides, is like, it can be really hard to see where you are shooting, even on like 3D screens. I think that's something that Midway Mania is very good about. It's like, oh, okay, clearly, like, yes, I can see the like red dart or whatever that my color is. And I think that this actually did a really good job of that. Like, I don't know if that's quality of the screens or because it's now like a relatively sizable little blob of jelly that you're shooting, is like, okay, I can see where I'm shooting, and I have a decent sense of like how to aim and move this. So I think from that side, the shooting actually felt really good on it. I think the other part of it is that it's got the scenes are very busy. So there's like, there's basically like little coyotes, Crafty Coyotes, pups are who he is using, his gang of pups are stealing the pies. And you're basically trying to shoot the pies off them. And then occasionally Crafty Coyote shows up and you're supposed to shoot him. But there's a bunch of like background stuff that you can also shoot, and it responds to your hitting it. It feels a lot like a shooting gallery. Like, oh, there's a sign, and if you shoot the sign, it like flips and spins, and then it says something else. Or like, you can shoot like, oh, there's a frog character in the back who's just part of the background. He's doing something, and like you shoot him, and like his hat pops off, and he responds to that. And so I think it's sort of, there's like a lot going on in all of the scenes, which in some sense is very fun. I did learn as I was going through that, like, oh, you don't get any points for shooting the background stuff. It's like, okay, so I'm not going to worry about points because I want to see what happens when I shoot the bear playing the guitar and like see his guitar strings pop or whatever. So if you're not worried about the points, you can shoot all of that. I will say that one of the downsides, and I think this is an issue that I have with like lots of interactive dark rides, is that there's a couple points where it sort of stops and you can take in the whole scene, but like lots of times you're moving through it constantly, and so it's very hard to like see everything that's going on, especially if you're playing the game. And I think that's a problem with most dark rides. Again, I think Midway Mania solves this in a clever way of like, oh, you stop every scene, like where you're shooting, you are stopped in front of it. And so that's like, I think it's one of these things where I always go back and forth of like, oh, I kind of actually want to just sit here and watch the scenes because there is a story going on and like there's narration that I could pay attention to if I'm not focused on shooting. But then you're always, of course, tempted to shoot because shooting the little blast of jelly is fun. But I think it does do like the interactive part is fun. And I think it's like, again, partly because of cartoony and like brighter animation, like it's better than what Voyage to the Iron Reef had. And I feel like the actuation that's like Midway Mania is sort of better than a trigger, where the trigger, I feel like lots of times it's like, I can't tell if this is working or like, so I actually think that it was really fun. And then to your point about how Triotech using like lots of guidance from the first one, like looking at pictures in your article of like the old Knott's Berry Tales, like you can tell that the animation style is the same. Like there's in one of the photos in that interview post is like has the background of like what the wall behind the loading station looks like, and it's like, oh yeah, this looks the same. Like I can see in that picture Crafty Coyote like basically looks the same. Like he's maybe been modernized a little bit, but like same outfit, same sort of shape, same like the size, the proportions are all the same. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's like, this is a cool Disney-esque. You can sort of tell like, oh yeah, not surprising that Raleigh Crump worked on this. That I think capturing that animation is sort of like, that's what makes it fun and like cute to look at and stuff. And so I think they did a really good job of capturing that part of it.
Yeah, it's not like it's a the Simpsons ride at Universal where, the Simpsons they come equipped in a 2D universe and they've made it, completely 3D. It's actually the characters and the artwork, they translate well over the generations, and it's not like a jarring revelation.
Yeah.
How many times did you get to ride, and what was your high score?
I rode it I think 3 times, so 2 on Thursday night and then once during the day. I actually only tried so the second 2 times I rode it, I was not really shooting, trying to shoot at all. I think the first one I got 100 something thousand, but we didn't really know exactly what we were shooting at. I think my friend who the second time we rode, he was still trying, and he got a much higher score, 200 something thousand. I think the trick is, so at the end you're given a score, and I don't know like what the point, sometimes the word bonus pops up on the screen sometimes. I don't know what causes that. But I do know at the end it tells you the number of Crafty Coyotes that you've hit and the number of pies that you've hit. And the number of Crafty Coyotes is much lower. Just like he shows up a few times and like sometimes pops into a scene and pops out. So my guess is that if you can find and shoot as many Crafty Coyotes as possible, that's probably the trick to gain the higher score.
I love it. I love this insider information.
Yeah, I mean, those are all guesses. I actually have no idea, but
all right. Well, we'll get Triotech on the podcast hopefully soon, and maybe they can tell us the hidden secrets. I mean, you've done a good job as a relative outsider explaining the ride, and like I said, I'm very excited to get back to the West Coast eventually. I mean, Knott's, when I visited a couple years ago, it was seriously one of my favorite parks I've ever been to. It's beautiful. The food's great. They've got a great collection of coasters. I need to ride Hang Time. I need to see the KCL lighting package, as you mentioned. I just need to get back out there. So now that California is slowly but surely reopening their theme parks, and we're getting back to whatever normal is now. I hope I can get out there sooner rather than later, just because, between Bearry Tales, Hang Time, of course, Ghost Rider, Silver Bullet, all that good stuff, plus the opportunity to have carne asada fries. I mean, you can't really beat that.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and that was like just walking around nuts. It was like, I mean, I had this, so I went to California's Great America a few weeks ago, and that was like, I was sort of like, oh, the park seems just prettier than I remembered. And I felt sort of the same thing at Knott's, that like, I don't know how much they actually spent off season just like making things look nicer, but it's always been a very nice park to just kind of like hang out in. And I felt like even more so, I don't know if it was the extra decorations or like newer, better lighting in places or something, but it was like, oh, this is like, it's just kind of nice walking around here.
Yeah. Anything else before we put a bow on this podcast, Eric?
I think one last thing about Bearry Tales that I'll mention. So when Voyage to the Iron Reef first opened, we talked about, they had sort of talked about like, oh, mixing practical effects and screens. And I felt like on Voyage to the Iron Reef, they didn't do as much with the practical as maybe we'd hoped. And I think that's, it's 80-90% screens on Bearry Tales, but they do have like, there's a few scenes transitions between screens where like I think the physical props that they have sort of pop a little bit more, and there's one section that's kind of a long tunnel that's dark, and I don't actually even remember what it was on Voyage to the Iron Reef. I think you're maybe like going deeper underwater or something, but on this one it's like, oh, you're going into the spooky forest, and like it's filled with like strobe lighting and like neon props and characters and stuff that I think do it gave me sort of reminded me of like the indoor part of Verbolten, and like, oh, it's a spooky forest with like flashes of light and like some things on the wall, but like in a very cartoony way that I think now has like, it pops better in a way that like, oh, I think they're doing with the limited practical stuff they have. I think they're doing a little bit more with it. There are also a couple of scenes that have like good use of like, oh, raising the temperature, because you're next to, in one of the opening scenes, you're like next to the oven where they're cooking pies, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's like what's going on here. And there are a few where like, oh, blowing rushes of air at you and stuff. So I think there's not a ton of those 4D effects, but I think they use them really well here, and I think maybe better than they had on Voyage to the Iron Reef, and better than they do on a lot of similar dark rides.
Nice. Well, Knott's, as you said, Eric, is open now. Reservations are required for the time being. So if you get out there, be sure to check out Knott's Bearry Tales Return to the Fair. Obviously, our good friends over at Triotech, they did some good work, it sounds like, on this one.
Yeah. Yes, very happy with it. Also, for now, still only California residents, although again, I think that rule from the state goes away in mid-June, and I would guess the park will follow suit shortly thereafter. So keep an eye on that. But I would guess that if you wanted to come from out of state, mid to late summer, you're probably good. Don't come quite yet.
All in all, get a vaccine. This has been a PSA from your good friends at Coaster101.
Yes.
That's going to do it for this week's episode of the Coaster101 podcast. As always, make sure you're liking, rating, reviewing, telling your friends, telling your enemies, forcing your family to listen on car rides. Help people find us. That's what we need. We'll keep this podcast going as long as people want to listen. So the more people who listen, the more people review it. If you like it, tell people, and other people will find it, and maybe they'll like it too. Be sure to check out our website, coaster101.com. There's a really good article that Eric wrote about the reopening of Knott's Berry Farm and presumably his trip to Knott's Berry Farm. Like I said earlier, I haven't read it yet, but I know it's really good because Eric wrote it. Also, make sure to follow us on social media. We're at Coaster101, anywhere you consume it, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. If you've got any questions, comments, concerns, fan mail, hate mail, or want to tell us your favorite boysenberry food item, send us an email, podcast@coaster101.com. Thanks, as always, to Justin Mabry of JM Music Design for our theme music. That'll do it for this week, and we will talk to y'all again soon. See ya.
Bye.